Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of the webinar on podcast from the VVSOR Statistics Communications section. We have sent out the link again because unfortunately some people could not join us right now, but for them we'll make the recording available. John, I've already introduced you, I hope. So, about stats and stories, we can feel your enthusiasm right here in the Netherlands. So please take the floor.
Thank you.
I'm really excited.
Me too. I'd much rather be in the Netherlands with you right now, talking in person. I mean, that would be much more fun. I just now have to figure out how I'm projecting my screen again. So if you'll excuse me for 1 sec, let's see. I'm gonna do. See, this is what happens, Nika, when you give me a week of time to forget something. So the joys of using the technologies that we were. So let's see. Desktop share. Show desktop. Okay. Hey, I think we're cooking now. So very good. So it's again a pleasure to be here. I thought Jas did a great job of giving some context and some perspective on building out a podcast, and I think what I'm challenged to do here is to give you a bit of an origin story about our podcast, how it evolved, and what we're going to be, what we might think about into the future. So that's where we are. I highlight on here my affiliations that I'm at Miami University, and I'm at there's my Twitter handle as well as the Stats and Stories Twitter handle that you are welcome to connect to if you have interest in this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a little bit of perspective, a little bit of context about journalism and statistics, how that evolved into a Stats and Stories podcast. I'm going to answer some questions that others have posed in the past before I also open this up for questions that you might have. And lastly, I have an appendix here. I do not count 1, 2, 3A. The A is appendix, and that gives a little bit of an ISI commercial for those of you that are interested in the ISI, which is actually based in Den Haag. So I want to start with an acknowledgement. First, a thanks for Ninka for the invitation to participate in this event. It's truly a delight and an honor for me to be here with you. I also need to acknowledge Richard Campbell, my co-founder and partner in crime for very many years, and Rosemary Pennington, our moderator. I think that that there was a comment about that Jas had about the importance of different voices and perspectives and a good moderator. And Rosemary is an amazing moderator, and she took over from another very strong moderator that we had who had been a former news director, Bob Long. So we've been very fortunate. So I never want to forget the thank yous that are part of any time you do this type of work. So it's always an important question to say, where in the heck, Miami University in Ohio? What the heck is that? So the dot in the north that's where Oxford, Ohio is, where I'm located. And the dot in the south of this is where Miami, Florida is. So for anybody that has confusion or is wondering what in the heck is he talking about, that's where I am. And just to give you just to help solidify this, let me just contrast winters in the two places. So this is a winter in Miami, Florida will look something like this. That's the University of Miami in Florida. And in contrast, what you may see in a winter in Oxford, Ohio, at Miami University looks like this. So just to give you some sense that maybe it's not quite the same place, but in fact, it generally right now it looks probably more like this with the leaves not on the trees. So that's kind of where I hang my hat. So let me transition immediately into the talk. So there are things that we can learn from journalists in statistics. And, one of the things that and talking to my colleagues, journalists make significant interesting. There are lots of times that what a journalist is trying to do is engage an audience, and statistics are often serve as plot. They're plot elements. They're not the story itself, but they're elements of the story. And we need to think about how we put facts in context. And that's the quote there at the bottom is a quote that Rosemary Pennington had about her job and what journalists' jobs are. And this is how they they proceed. But when I think about what's a statistician's job is to conduct and communicate what we do, and we want to have impact. I mean, we do our work to have impact. But how often do we think about grabbing the interest of our audience or making the significant interest or putting the significant interesting or putting facts in context? So this is an important part of producing what we do and having impact. So how do we think about it? Well, one of the things that happened as I was starting, and well, not necessarily starting in my career, but partway through my career, I began to think a lot about effective communication of journalism and statistics. There's a great book by John Allen Paulos called "A Mathematician Reads the Newspaper." He also wrote the book Innumeracy. One book that I really highlight here is the News and Numbers book by Cohn and Cope, which is a classic book for journalists, which included the kinds of questions a journalist should be asking a statistician. And statisticians ultimately need to be ready to answer. And this was something that I thought about and I ended up incorporating in many of my classes early on. So as I go through this, I then thought, well, how does this translate into what we do in Stats and Stories? Well, let's take a trip down memory lane. And if we go back to the start of this, my college, CAS stands for the College of Arts and Science at my university, was thinking about having a quantitative literacy requirement. And we wanted to have a demonstration of how quantitative literacy could be part of a humanities class. As part of that, I was team teaching a news and numbers course with Richard Campbell, who at the time was the director of the journalism program. I was also pretty involved in the statistical profession in different societies, including the American Statistical Association and the International Statistical Institute, first on council and later. Could I move my mouse? It remains on the sheets. Yes, I would be happy to do that. Sorry. Is that better? Yep. Ah, perfect. Thank you. And so I was involved in this, and there was also the first World Statistics Day, 2010. And so there were all of these things that were coming up. And so I was thinking a lot about communicating. I have the picture here of Joel Best's book. This is another marvelous book. It's a book, Stat Spotting, A Field Guide to Dubious Data. And I would recommend that for these as just general ones that you might be interested in looking at. So we taught this class and we said, well, we can't do this time and time again. It was very expensive because there were two chairs of departments, team teaching a class, and we just didn't know the impact of it was not going to be as broad as we wanted. But there were these things called podcasts that were coming on the scene. And so we thought, how do we help a broader community understand the statistical aspects of complicated stories? And so it's interesting. I think I can touch on some of the things that Jos mentioned in his talk, which included the idea of defining an audience. And our audience was very broad: journalists, statisticians, the general public, students, teachers of intro stat, and more. And then if you're thinking about doing a podcast, one of the things that I would ask you is to consider what inspirations you might find. And I mentioned three inspirations here. Freakonomics was telling stories of behavioral economics and journalism with a journalist is in partnership. Science Friday is a National Public Radio, both podcast and radio program that talks about science news and development in science. And Car Talk was a very chatty, conversational radio show / podcast that had two brothers that were talking about just repairing cars. But the thing that I loved about it was the casual interaction, just the fun that was had within that. And these are all inspirations for what we were thinking about. We talked about we originally were thinking about, there was a show called Nightline on in the US where there might be a 3 to 5 minute intro followed by conversation. Well, the way we started from the first episode is we needed to think about logistics. Now, we had the benefit of high quality audio options. We could record in a former public radio studio. So we had a great opportunity there. And we also had an engineer that was helping with us. So we could start in a much simpler way for us in terms of technical implementation. We made decisions about who was on the air, and we had a moderator and two panelists and a guest. So the moderator kind of shaped the flow of the program, and the statistician and a journalist, me being the statistician and Campbell the journalist, were then interacting along with the moderator with some guests. And the topics, we wanted to have a mix of both serious and fun. So then we had some post-production, and you've already heard about some of those issues. Originally, we were very much focused on just getting it up on iTunes and then also having it available through our website. Some of our early decisions, we always had live guests in our studio. The bottom right is Barry Nussbaum, who is the president of the American Statistical Association, who really helped jump in. Top left is Trevor Butterworth, who's a journalist who's been involved in the Stats.org effort and others. And bottom left is the communications person, Regina Nuzzo. And then we have a top right is a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So we had a very broad mix of guests, but they were all in the studio. And you can even look behind the glass window from the studio guests. The first guest, this is now we're in February of 2013, and we had a person from the U.S. Census involved. And we had recorded the show, and then we sent it out for comment. And one of the things that I would encourage you to think about if you're going to do this is be ready to change. If you were to listen to some of our early episodes, go back and listen to episode 2 or 3, and then listen to episode 162 or 163 of our show, and you'll see a very different flow and rhythm. And so you do change and get better. But one of the things we found out was that when we sent out our first episode for review, there was attraction to the flow of it, the idea, the moderator's voice, but it was too long to get to the interview. There's too much jargon, and we were, it was accused of potentially inducing ear fatigue. So you really have to think about a listener's experience with this. You can't have people monologuing on shows. I mean, actually, kind of like what I'm doing right now. So in essence, I'm monologuing, but you may not want to listen to this if you were doing this on a podcast. So, we thought, well, we need to deal with this. And we actually, I thought Yas's point about scripting was really a critical one. Overly scripting episodes sound stilted. Hi, I'm John. Welcome to my podcast. Pause for appreciation. It's horrible if you have it too stilted and too scripted. It has to be a natural conversation. And so that's one of the things we dealt with. We had to have transcripts. This was part of accessibility. We were posting this up, and there are certain legal requirements within the U.S., but this is also, I think of as a moral imperative. It makes your show accessible. Since we're doing our show in English, if someone has English as a second language, having the transcript might also be a great resource for them. So that was something that we wanted to make sure happened. We also, I had previously mentioned the episode, our involvement on Twitter. My personal involvement really ramped up when we started the podcast because I was helping with trying to get this message out. Some of the checklists, just to give you an idea of this. And by the way, for those of you that are interested, I will share a copy of my slides with Ninka. I've already will forward that after our recording here today. And, these are some of the things we did. Think about guests, think about preparation before, during, and after the guests. And then what do you do when you release an episode? And everything from email to social media outreach would be part of the planned efforts as you think about promoting what you do. This is what what we look like probably from this 2013 to the middle of about 2018. That was this is our landing page, and you saw a little bit when we started to get ASA support. But one of the things we found is we needed to really up our game. We had some financial support, which allowed us to think about a budget, to think about connecting to. We had the professional society that helped with connections. We also had a professional society that might also help to promote. ISI does, and now RSS does as well, because we've connected to the magazine Significance, and we would promote some of their presenters, their authors, as well as stories that they were telling. And one of the challenges was, how do we get to more regular release? We had the Science Friday group came to my campus and did a live show, and I had a chance to talk to their producer. And one of the things that she told me was that the critical aspect was to have a regular release schedule and a solid landing page and a website. And one of the things we did is we ended up connecting to public radio in the United States. That's something. They have a whole series of podcasts. So that was one way that we increased visibility. We started changing our website, and we started changing the images, and kind of when you landed on a page, it was a very different feel. And if you go to the statsandstories.net site afterwards, you'll see very different looks. This carousel of images. We also have the images that you see are from Pexels, which are open source, images that can be used. So that was one of the things that we ended up doing. We even modernized our logo. So you saw the logo that we had started with a few slides ago, and now we have this is our kind of new look and feel. Just to let you know, and for those of you that want to do this, we have to. These are some of the things we end up doing. And I talked to Charles Blades, our producer, and updating this. We schedule the recording, but we also have to get guest releases. We have to get, when we're recording this, we have to say, look, we're going to be using your voice, just like, by having the video live and by having my name identified, I'm giving permission essentially for the use of this by VVSOR in the communications group. We had to, there's an audio version of what's recorded that's edited, that's sent out for transcription, that's sent to the guest, that's checked. We want to make sure that the guest is getting something that is also be of value to them. I mean, we think we want to be enhancing, and as we say in our catchphrase, ways of telling the statistics behind the stories and the stories behind the statistics. We talk about a range of topics, sports, health, politics. So Yas, you might in particular like the episode we did a few years ago on the World Cup. So we had an episode related to that. We've had an episode related to American football. We had an episode related to the analytics there, as well as some baseball and the coverage of baseball in the U.S. So we've had some of those, but we've had a number on health, including what do clinical trials look like. Or most recently, one of our episodes talked about kind of patient monitoring and doing that. We've talked about politics. The U.S. Census has been a common topic, and we've had journalists, guests, statisticians, scientists, all sorts of individuals of different interests. But maybe in the very bottom line here is ultimately that we focus on guests and topics that we find interesting, things that we enjoy. And that's something that we think would be a model. If we're interested and engaged, those are things that would be maybe of broader interest and appeal. One of the things that we changed was we had Bob Long retire, who was a former news bureau person from public radio, and we welcomed Rosemary Pennington, who had public radio and podcast experience. This was important for multiple ways. I mean, she was a great voice. She's been a great addition and really enhanced our program. And it's enhanced kind of the voices that you hear that are associated with the program. So then we have this partnership with ASA. We also, as part of increasing our release, the frequency of release, we not only have Stats and Stories, which is about a 28-minute plus or minus duration program. We have Stats and Short Stories, which includes a 5 to 7 minute piece. Can be a little bit longer at times. So it allowed us to think about kind of a mix, but both we think work. We've also increased our kind of our promotional efforts. Here's a bar graph of, I guess as a statistician, I had to have some graphics, and generally, people talk about, data to ink ratio. So don't get mad at me for the data visualization components, but this gives you a sense of how much we've really ramped up our offerings. Went from going from a point where we had everything face to face, we were just being able to release about every 6 to 8 weeks to easily being able to do every week or 50 times a year pretty readily, just because of having additional support and also doing a lot of the recording virtually. The current state is, hey, guess what? The same way that I'm joining you is the same way we're doing our recordings, and we're doing these are virtual audio recordings. So the top right is a recording with one of our recent guests, and the bottom left was a couple of different guests that were associated with a virtual session that we had the Royal Statistical Society. We're making this work, and I think it goes pretty well. So does anyone listen? So this graph, and it's tough to see on the y-axis, but this is basically the orange, the deeper shade is kind of listens in the last that day. How many people listen on a given day? And so you're seeing that 400 to 500 are listening on the day of release, but then that gray shading shows kind of all time listenings, and it goes up through more, almost 1,000 is pretty common, and we're seeing even some of our most listened to episodes are more well beyond 1,800 listens, and some of these range from the Harvard Data Science Review episode with Xiaoli Meng to a coronavirus visualization episode with someone from the Data Visualization Society to some others that mapping the false discovery rate was with Yoav Benjamini, kind of a statistician extraordinaire that joined us, and then discussions of biases, and that white hat bias was in the context of some nutritional research that's done. So we have just a variety of topics, but the question is, anybody listening? Not surprisingly, given that we're an English-based podcast, that most of our listens come from the, kind of the U.S., UK, Canada, and Australia. Those are some of the guests that we've had. But we also, you can see, we've had listens from from Brazil, Germany, and Denmark. So we do have some impact broader. But we'd like to continue growing. I guess we just want to make sure that we have some impact, and we dream big. I mean, we've gone from having, maybe 2 years ago, 300 people following us on our Twitter feed on Stats and Stories to almost 1,900 now. We have a budget that covers kind of a halftime producer and more, and some transcription. We also pay for. We're paying for some SoundCloud hosting. We're paying for website hosting, and we've also bought the domain name. We're leasing the domain name statsandstories.net. We have potential partnerships in the future. There's a new ISI special interest group on communicating statistics and data science, and that's one that we might see in the future. So, where are we now? Well, we're in a situation where we often think about a climate where opinion is almost viewed as fact. We get our news from echo chambers. We have fake news assertions commonly. How do we deal with this? And one of the ways within our podcast, we want to challenge some of those ideas. The fact that there are other ways that we can come to understand the news and the statistics behind it. So, I will let, Peter, I will respond to that. I'm going to postpone responding to that for a sec. Well, no, I'll respond to it now. Do we get the same audiences for each podcast? I think there's a core that's common, but I think that there's often that it'll often pick up other people depending on the topic. So that's an important point. And actually that's one of the things that you could think about as you develop proposals for your own podcasts, or as you think about trying to expand the reach of your podcasts. So I'm going to close here with I've got a series of questions that I think might be of some interest. What do you get from listening to to your podcast? And I think that we're pretty invested in the idea how do you construct, frame, and communicate quantitative ideas? That's a big part of what we do. And we want to introduce kind of the breadth of these ideas. And you want to have interesting conversations with interesting people. And it's got to be, if you do the same thing time and time again, it's in my mind, it's kind of like always having the same thing for dinner each night, every week, forever. You have to have some variety, some spice, and you have to think about how that works. How do we find guests? A lot of times it's personal relations. If I'm at I asked Xiaoli Meng to be a guest when I met him at a statistical meeting a number of years ago, just about the time the Harvard Data Science Review was starting up. And I contacted someone else from an NRC panel to be a guest. And this is one that we haven't recorded yet. So there's a colleague who's a cognitive psychologist who studies risk communication that we're going to have on as a guest. And I know him from committee service. I asked for virtual introductions from the publishers of Significance, the main editor of Significance, colleagues from the professions. I have cold contacts. I'll walk up to presenters at conference if I think they're doing something interesting and ask them that they'd be willing to be a guest. And or I've read something that I think is pretty interesting. And so my colleagues in journalism have been interested in this question of what are called news deserts, that the coverage in certain rural parts, particularly in the U.S., of news and local news is disappearing. I mean, there's been a real disruption of journalism and the whole business plan and the financing of journalism. How does that play out? And that leads to these contacts. Topics. It's in the news. They're in journal articles. We talk to the editor of Significance and Chance now and say, what are you covering now? And then who might be good from that in the stories? Emerging issues in statistics and journalism. I just mentioned news deserts, but the idea of, the p-value story or the controversy of p-values, how do we make that into a story we tell? If it's Valentine's Day, we've talked about people that have done things looking at studying sexual behavior or relationships. If it's back to school, we talk about educational analytics. If it's the World Cup or sports seasons, we talk about sports or soccer analytics. For Earth Day, we might talk about environmental statistics or stories about the measuring impact of plastics or the magnitude of plastics in the environment. We try to have special highlights if there's activities in a year. So this year is the International Year of Women in Statistics and Data Science. That's the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale. We've had a number of episodes that are tied to that. The 25th anniversary of R was the focus of a number of episodes as well. How have we tried to increase listenership, or are there ways that we've done it? We've hosted contests to write a title or a headline to explain Bayesian methods. The weekly release schedule and improving the web page were part of it. We did the live virtual show at RSS, and we may be doing that in other contexts. One thing that you'll find is if you have a guest with a strong social media presence, this will often translate to a community that you may have not reached previously. And I think that ties to Peter's question about, attracting the same audience or slightly different audiences as well. How do you quantify your success? Part of it is we can look at who listens to at least a couple of minutes of an episode. So I showed you some of those bar graphs of, about 14 to 1600 is very usual. We can peak up to about 2000 listens. We look at who's following us, the Stats and Stories Twitter handle, what interests there are. I think one kind of informal anecdote, I don't know if it's anecdotal, but it's certainly informal, is the unsolicited suggestions for stories is another source. Ninka mentioned the fact that we did get some recognition from professional societies about what we've done and about the impact, and that's just was a source of honor and delight for us. And the fact that people say yes when we ask them is a huge part of saying, I'd say that's part of the success of the story. Some final thoughts that I might share at this point is, this is a labor of love. It started out as something that we do. None of us ever trained to do podcasts, to talk to guests, to do this. This is not what none of us, well, certainly not me. My journalist colleagues had more of this type of experience of interacting with guests as part of, or with people that might be contributing to stories. Rosemary's doing it. She started this as an assistant professor, and Richard has continued to do this as a panelist after his retirement. So it's if you got to have fun with this. If it's not something that you're going to enjoy, it's going to be a lot of work without a lot of pleasure. Here's where I'm going to, Yas said I need to challenge you all. So this model can work. And I'd like to say, what about VVSOR working with journalism colleagues to form the first Stats and Stories Dutch edition, or Statistieken en Verhalen Nederlands. So maybe this is both a horrible pronunciation, but also and maybe a bad translation from Google. But I think there's an opportunity for this to generalize, because there are stories that would be of direct relevance. My stories about the U.S. Census may not resonate with a Dutch audience, but the stories about this parrot in New Zealand that's thinking about that's able to demonstrate probabilistic reasoning, that might be a fun story. Or the idea of how do you study sexual behavior, that might be a fun story to think about. Or analytics for sport might be, again, a fun story to tell. So I would suggest this might be something to consider as you look forward developing your own efforts or your own podcasts. I again want to thank you for this opportunity to join you. If you want to find out, where I am and who I am, there's email. There's also my Twitter handle. It's @John_Baylor, or the Stats and Stories podcast. And again, it's been my pleasure to be here. It's such a treat. I only wish that I could be there in person to be interacting with you. So again, thank you.
Thank you, John. Now we have some time for questions. Judith has asked a question. I will check if I can put her live. No, so I will read the question. What are your thoughts on non-native English speakers podcasting in English?
I think that's great. I mean, I have to tell you that one of my first times when I visited the Netherlands, I was struck by how many of the Dutch spoke English better than I did. So I think that for many people, I think it's wonderful. I mean, if that's something that you'd like to do, that's great. It's in part because I think that's what is your comfort level in that. So you listen to The Effective Statistician for the first time. The host was just so German, not sure whether or not that was, I think this gets back to Jas's point about how do you target what's the audience that you have in mind for your show. We're building a show that I hope that statisticians would enjoy. I hope that VVSOR colleagues would enjoy listening to Stats and Stories. But it's also a show that my dad listens to, and my dad will tell me about the episodes. you know, and you know, and then he'll say, "Did you notice when he said?" I said, "Yeah, Dad, I was there." You know, that's if you have a very broad community. I had my niece tell me that her teacher at the high school required them to listen to some of the Stats and Stories episodes as part of it. That to me is the sense of, you know, I'm reaching the kind of that's the kind of impact, the breadth of impact. You know, if you have to decide if that's kind of where you are and what you're doing. Now, you mentioned, I think that like. You know, Hillary Parker and Roger Peng's podcast, The Not So Standard Deviations, they're brilliant. There are a number of just really outstanding podcasts that are out there. They tend to have a different focus. They're looking at kind of data science topics or beyond, and you know, we're not exclusively data. We're kind of statistical in the stories that are tied to these, and they, you know, that's kind of, you know, Jos mentioned the idea of identifying a niche. That's part of where we sort of thought about our niche.
Great. Are there any other questions from the audience? Live questions, maybe?
Well, if there aren't, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I have a question for the audience. How many of you know a journalist? Okay. How many of you find some of the ways that statistics is reported in the press maddening? What are things that you know, if that's the case, that to me, that's opportunity. Hey, Karina, good to see you. I see you there in the corner. So that's so, you know, I think there's an opportunity there if you wish to pursue it. Have any of you thought about having your own podcast or starting up a podcast? Maybe?
Nienke.
Nienke, a little bit? You know, have you thought about what type of topic you might consider?
Well, obviously, yeah, statistics related. I think because there's just so much that could be done about, you know, educating, entertaining. There's so much misconceptions around statistics, around numbers, around. So yeah, that's what I would think. So I've loved hearing, you know, your story about how Stats and Stories came together, and how it evolved over time, and that kind of thing. But I've never made a podcast so far.
Yeah, you know, I have seen some I think Roger Peng posted it may be either a blog post or has had something else related to kind of the equipment for doing a podcast. Kind of what is the minimal set of resources. You know, so Jos mentioned the idea of kind of equipment. So here's an example. This is my mic. So I'm not using a regular the mic that's built into my computer. We're using one this is a I can't remember the brand, but it's in some sense, because we're recording and we're using Audacity, which is something Jos mentioned, which is free. We're doing this recording on FaceTime, but what happens is we all do our recordings remotely. So I do my recording. You know, Nienke, if you were a guest, you would do your recording on your local machine, and then the producer will put it together. So there is basically a combination of mixing. The reason that editing matters is when we have guests on, I brief a guest when they come on to our show. So suppose Peter was going to be a guest, or Nienke, you were going to be a guest. The first thing I would do is I would say, okay, Stats and Stories this is the way the episode will flow. Rosemary will introduce the episode, and then she will give a short introduction to the focus of the episode. Then we're going to have about 13 minutes of conversation, then a break, and then about 13 minutes of conversation, then a close. The good news is if you start answering a question and you don't like the way you started, you could say, hey, let me start again. And that way, when you're editing this, the post-production is where it'll take a lot of time. The time to do a show like this, you know, where you're recording just live and stream, you know, basically that's not the challenge. The challenge is the post-production to clean it up and make it sound good. And so that's where you really want to invest some of your energy. And by doing that, it makes for a tighter program. In terms of the duration, it was interesting that Jos said 15 to 30 minutes. You know, we do about 28 minutes because we thought that's about the time that someone who is commuting could listen to a full episode. So if you were going to ride, you know, if you were riding the tram to work, or, that's about, maybe about a 25 to 30-minute commute is about what you might expect. So we were thinking about that in terms of setting up duration. Any other questions or concerns? This is a lot like when I teach too, by the way. Yeah.
Well, maybe you could. Oh, sorry. Was
Please
someone
go
else?
ahead.
Oh, well, I thought maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about, because I think I've heard you mention during a meeting when you were in the Netherlands that you started, with more of a script in Stats and Stories, and then over time you started to be more relaxed with the script and started to rely less on scripting or on a script. Could you elaborate? Could you revisit that maybe?
Sure, that's a great point. One thing about scripting is it can sound very stiff. Right now, we're having a conversation, and so I didn't know you were going to ask that question. I couldn't prepare for that question. I couldn't be, I had to react to that question and respond to that question. It's almost like two humans talking. Right? It's almost like we're face to face and we can be doing this. And that's I think that's an important part. When we were heavily scripted, it ended up being, it felt artificial. It sounded like robots having a conversation. Hi, Ninka, thank you for inviting me. I am having fun now. How about you? I mean, it's so stilted and so unnatural that it's just not something that you need to kind of find a way to get to the point of this comfort level. And, one of the things I believe that, so by the way, all of you that are attending, you now have a homework. So your homework is go ahead and I listen to episode 2, then listen to, didn't pass the Turing test. Thanks, Peter. People that meet me, Peter, sometimes wonder if I could pass the Turing test. No. So, one of the things that you can do is listen to episode 2, then listen to episode 62, and then maybe listen to episode 162, and see if you can hear the difference in the flow. See if you can, listen to what we do and how it evolves. One of the things that we do is, we get background documents that when we're starting with a guest that our producer ends up going and digging. Or when I used to do all the production, by the way, before we hired a producer. I used to get the permission signed. I used to schedule the episodes. I used to, coordinate all of this. Now that we're getting some of this, we get background and we get career foundation stuff. So we have kind of that support.
And John, do you also prepare the speakers beforehand if they, for example, never did a podcast before?
That's a really great question. I mean, all of these have been great questions, but I've had some people that have been very reluctant to appear. And some people have, so for example, if you had a government official that was going to appear, they may worry about this, and we would say, you can listen to the episode before we go live with it. Or I've had other people say, one guest actually had been covered in kind of broadcast news, and really they had misrepresented what they had done, and there was real concern about misrepresentation of the work. And we talked through it, and I said, this is what we're planning on doing. It's not uncommon for some guests that are that maybe have never done this to say, what kind of questions will you ask me? And sometimes I'll send them just with an email reply and say, here are some of the questions that we might ask. But again, it's a conversation. So, I might start with a set of questions, but your answer may determine the way the conversation evolves.
Yeah, I listened to a few of the podcasts and it sounds quite spontaneous. To the later ones, I haven't checked the 2013 ones yet. But,
Well, good. And I hope. So, which one did you like the best of the ones you listened to?
The one on sports statistics. I think it's an older one.
Oh, very good. Okay. The one, the football one.
No, it was more general about what
general?
they could do. I don't know which number it was, but yeah.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I guess. Would you like to? would you like to take a tour of our site? Would that? I mean, I don't know how much we have. What, 5 minutes left, Ninka?
Yes.
Okay. Or actually, you all can leave too. I mean, it's up to you. Okay. So
we can take
all right.
a small tour.
So let me pull up a. And by the way, at the very bottom of the slides, there's the information on the website on ISI. Let's see. So. So one of the things that I'd mentioned is having a good website is something that I would recommend. And one of the things you'll notice is, the most recent story is the women of Hull House who did some of this is Sharon Lohr was the guest. Monitoring health data is now a personalized medicine. Now, I want you to do you notice how you're looking at images? What's it like this is we had the chief statistician from the BBC News join us talking about reporting and statistics. Whether or not, I mean, in the U.S., there was real controversy about polling and whether or not there were some issues about can you still predict polling. And then this was an issue about, we had a guest from South Africa talking about teaching statistics both pre and post-apartheid. And so what we've set up is we have a carousel that goes through episodes. And you notice that it's images here. It's not a text-laden, if you compared it in the earlier screen to this. You see that this is kind of a more like, wow, what? And then you have to look at it a little more closely, and you realize that within the episodes link, you have background here for the guests. And you also, one of the things we did is, so one of our guests has the pod of Asclepius, which is more kind of data science and health. And that was, Glenn Wright Colopy was our guest. And that's kind of an example of we're doing some also cross promotion. And that's another way that you can build this. Delia North was talking about it. Rob Santos was talking about census relations. And, so we've had guests that cover a variety. Tamandra Harkness was talking about statistics and humor. Tim Harford is part of the More or Less Radio 4 program in the UK, he was a brilliant guest. And then the discussion of the new podcast was an episode that featured Megan Higgs and Ashley Steele talking about what motivated it. Visualization in the 19th century was a conversation with Alison Headley. And you'll notice we don't just have statisticians. Her background is communication and culture. When we were talking about teaching efforts, Teaching Better, that was a guest who was a chemistry education professor who was in charge of a teaching excellence center. So, we ended up building out episodes in ways that we thought would be interesting. We ended up with ability to access, have it organized in topics. And then we have resources and other components that might be of some interest. So, I mean, this is some of the things that we have done and how we've portrayed and processed what we do. So let me stop that. And I think I can stop my desk. Is it stop desktop? Ninka, you're going to have to help me here with this. I don't.
Stop sharing at the bottom.
Stop sharing at the bottom.
Yeah.
No, there. So someone stopped me from sharing. Stop him before he shares again. This is a. So I thank you for your interest and taking the time out of your busy days and for the kind invitation for me to join you. It's I miss seeing my Dutch friends. I miss having the opportunity to come and interact directly with you. But I hope that through this you'll have a chance to engage in the statistics behind the stories and the stories behind the statistics with me on our podcast.
John, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing with us the story behind Stats+Stories. I think it was really interesting. Also to have like a look behind the curtain, what's going on when you make a podcast. So thanks a lot for being with us today. Also, thank you, Jos. Thanks again. And thank you all for attending. That was great. A small thing, if you think like, wow, that would be interesting to make a podcast, or you're like triggered by this Stats+Stories NL idea, or get in contact with us. Just send an email reply. We'll also linger around a little bit in this room if you feel like getting in contact right away. And so yeah, that concludes the webinar on podcast from the VVSOR Statistics Communications section. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ninka, if there's anybody that would like to talk to, we could always, if you're interested in starting something up and you'd like to talk to our producer about some of the technical issues and what software is being used and how it's being used or what recommendations, I mean, we'd be happy to set up a time to try to do that kind of connection.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, well, so friends, I'm going to go. I think I have homeworks to grade, and unfortunately, our semester comes to a close, so I have to still do that other work.
Yeah, watch out there's a delivery coming to your house somewhere today, probably in the afternoon.
Oh, well,
I don't know how accurate UPS is in their details, but keep an eye out.
I will, and I have a partner here who will inform me if any delivery person comes close to our house or if any squirrels look at us. So I will know if either event occurs.
That's great.
All right. So good to see you all, and thanks again for the opportunity to join you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Nienke.
Bye, Karina.